There is a war described in the Bible that most people have never truly thought about. Not a war between nations. Not a war between humans. A war fought in heaven itself before any of us existed, and the Bible gives us almost no details about it. Just enough to know it happened. Just enough to make you wonder what it changed. Most people who grew up in any tradition that touches the Bible have heard the name Lucifer. They've heard the word Satan. They've heard, in fragments, that there was a fall, that something went wrong before the world was the way it is now. But when you actually go looking for that story in the text, you find something strange. The details are almost completely missing. What you're left with is a handful of verses, a few scattered images, and a silence so loud it almost feels deliberate. This is not a story about religion. It's not a sermon. It's an attempt to sit inside one of the oldest and most unexplained events in any sacred text and ask the questions that almost no one asks out loud. What actually happened? When did it happen? Who was involved? And why? If this event is as significant as the text seems to suggest, does the Bible treat it like a footnote? The closest thing to a direct account of the war in heaven appears in the book of Revelation, chapter 12. It's a short passage, only a few verses, and it arrives in the middle of one of the most visually overwhelming books ever written, surrounded by trumpets, plagues, beasts, collapsing stars. John describes a great dragon, red and enormous, with 7 heads and 10 horns. He describes the dragon's tail sweeping a third of the stars from the sky. And then he describes a war, an actual war, erupting in heaven. The archangel Michael leads his forces against the dragon and its forces. There is a battle. The dragon loses. And then the dragon and all its followers are cast out, thrown down to the earth, and the voice that follows says something chilling. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, filled with great fury, because he knows his time is short. That's it. That's essentially all Revelation gives you. A war breaks out. Michael fights. The dragon falls. And humanity's world becomes the landing site for whatever was expelled from above. What makes this passage so deeply strange is not just what it says, it's what it doesn't say. We're not told why the war started. We're not told how long it lasted. We're not given the dragon's point of view, or the cause of the conflict, or the internal logic of a rebellion happening in a realm that is supposedly perfect. The text presents it almost the way a history book might reference an ancient coup, with the assumption that you already know the backstory. Except there is no backstory. Not clearly. Not anywhere. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because if you search the entire Bible for the origin of this war, what you find is not a single coherent narrative. What you find are pieces, fragments. A line in Isaiah, passage in Ezekiel, a phrase in Luke, a verse in Job. These texts were written centuries apart, by different authors, in different languages, for different purposes. And yet, when you lay them side by side, they begin to sketch the outline of something that feels like a story older than humanity, set in a realm we can't see, involving a conflict we were never meant to witness. The question of when this war happened may be the most unsettling one of all, because the answer isn't clear, and the different possibilities each carry their own implications. Some theologians and scholars have argued that the war in heaven described in Revelation is not a past event at all, that it's a future or ongoing symbolic narrative written in the apocalyptic style of its time, designed to communicate something about the nature of spiritual reality rather than a specific historical moment. In this reading, the war is more like a metaphor, operating on a cosmic scale, the eternal conflict between order and chaos, described in the language of angels and dragons because that's the only language large enough to hold it. But others read the account differently. They argue that the war happened at a very specific point in cosmic history, before the creation of humanity, or possibly even before the creation of the physical universe itself. In this view, whatever took place in heaven was not symbolic. It was real. It was the first conflict in the history of existence. And the world that humanity was born into was already, in some sense, a world marked by that event, already a place where something ancient and hostile had been given a foothold. There's a third perspective, less commonly discussed, that places the war not at the beginning, but at a specific moment within human history perhaps, at the moment of the fall in Eden, or at the time of Jesus' ministry. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus makes a passing remark that has fascinated scholars for centuries. He says, simply, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." The disciples had returned excited about their own power to drive out spirits. Jesus responds with this image present tense framed as past vision, and then moves on without explanation. A war, compressed into a single sentence. A cosmic event reduced to a subordinate clause. These three readings, symbolic, prehistoric, historical, don't necessarily contradict each other. They may be describing the same event from different angles, or they may represent different events entirely that have been layered together over centuries of interpretation. What they share is this: the sense that something happened above us or before us that fundamentally shaped the world we inherited. The figure at the center of all this is the one identified in Revelation as the dragon. In the same passage, he is called the ancient serpent, the devil, Satan. These are not different beings. The text explicitly names them as the same entity. But what this entity was before the war is a far more complicated question. This is where you enter territory that the Bible approaches only indirectly, through poetry and prophecy, in language so dense with imagery that scholars have argued about its meaning for thousands of years. The passage in Isaiah 14 is the one most commonly associated with the fall of a great heavenly being. The text is addressed to the king of Babylon, that much is clear in context. But the language escalates into something that seems to go beyond any earthly king. Whoever is being spoken to is described as having said in his heart that he would ascend to the heights of heaven, that he would raise his throne above the stars of God, that he would make himself like the Most High. The name used in the original Hebrew is Helel ben Shachar, meaning something close to Shining One, Son of the Dawn. The Latin translation, produced centuries later, rendered this as Lucifer. And from that translation, an entire mythology was born. The passage in Ezekiel 28 follows a similar pattern. Again, the text is addressed to a human ruler, the king of Tyre, but the language again escalates into something that seems to describe a being that existed before humanity, in Eden, adorned with precious stones, walking among fiery stones, blameless from the day of its creation until wickedness was found in it. Many readers over the centuries have understood this as a dual reference, a condemnation of an earthly king that simultaneously reaches back to describe the original fall of a heavenly being who now operates through earthly power. Others argue it's pure metaphor, poetic language about human arrogance dressed in mythological costume. Here is what makes this so difficult to resolve. Both interpretations are defensible. The ambiguity is not a mistake. It may be, in fact, the point. Sacred texts from many traditions use this technique, the double address, the layered meaning, the earthly event that mirrors a cosmic one. Whether you read these passages as literal accounts of a pre-human war or as poetic commentary on pride and its consequences, they are asking the same fundamental question. What happens when a powerful being decides that power is not enough? That question, what caused the war, is perhaps the most philosophically haunting part of the entire story, because nothing in the traditional account makes easy sense. If heaven is a place of perfection, how does a desire for rebellion originate there? If a being was created blameless, what internal process produces the decision to seek a throne above the one who made you? This is not a small puzzle. This is one of the oldest philosophical problems in monotheistic thought, and the text offers almost nothing in the way of an answer. The most common interpretation across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition is pride. The being who fell did so because it decided that its own greatness was sufficient, that it deserved not to serve, but to be served. This is the reading that frames the entire cosmic drama as a story about the corrupting nature of pride unchecked. The higher the position, the more catastrophic the fall. The closer to ultimate power, the more devastating the choice to reach for it rather than receive it. But there are other threads worth pulling. Some ancient texts, including those found outside the canonical Bible, describe the conflict not simply as pride, but as a dispute over humanity itself. In some early Jewish interpretations, the war in heaven was triggered by the creation of humans, by the command that angelic beings honor or serve this new, lower creation. In this reading, the rebellion was not about wanting to be God. It was about refusing to bow to something lesser. The pride was real, but its object was different. It was not the throne that the rebellious being wanted, it was the refusal to accept that a creature of dust could be elevated above creatures of fire and light. This interpretation changes the emotional texture of the story entirely. It makes the conflict feel less like a generic power grab and more like a specific existential protest, a refusal that, depending on how you look at it, almost feels understandable. Not justified, but understandable. And that discomfort is exactly what makes the story so compelling. Because a story with a villain who has a reason is far more unsettling than a story with a villain who is simply evil. There are also interpretations rooted in the idea of order versus disruption, that the war in heaven was not primarily about pride or about humans at all, but about the nature of created existence. In this view, what was cast out was not just a being but a principle, the principle that creation should define its own purpose rather than receive it. The dragon and its followers represent, in this reading, the cosmic manifestation of a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to determine one's own meaning. And the war is the moment when that principle is tested against the structure of the universe and found to be incompatible with it. None of these readings can be proven. They exist in the space between the lines of the text. But they are not arbitrary. Each one is drawn from real traditions, real ancient texts, real centuries of serious inquiry into what this event might mean. And what they all agree on is this: whatever happened in heaven was not small. The consequences were not small. And the casting out that followed the war changed something not just in the being who was expelled, but in the nature of the world that received it. After the war, according to Revelation, the dragon is thrown down to the earth. This detail is easy to read past, but it deserves to sit with you for a moment. Whatever this being was in heaven, however magnificent, however powerful, it now occupies the same plane of existence as humanity. It has been relocated. And the voice in Revelation's account does not celebrate this the way you might expect. Instead, it issues a warning. Heaven rejoices. Yes, but the earth is told to grieve, because what was lost, the heavens, has been gained by the world below. This is the emotional turn in the story that most retellings miss. The war in heaven is not just a victory. It is a displacement. The winning side wins the heavens, but the cost is that the losing side lands somewhere specific, lands somewhere inhabited. The casting down is not a neutralization. It is, in some readings, a transfer of threat from a realm where it could be contained to a realm where it cannot. The passage that follows in Revelation describes the dragon pursuing a woman who represents something larger than herself, a symbol of Israel, or of the community of faith, or of humanity in its fullest sense. The dragon wages war on her offspring, and the offspring, described as those who hold to certain truths, are described as being on earth, in a world the dragon now also occupies. The war, in other words, does not end with the casting out. It continues. It just changes location. This shift from a war above to a war below is one of the most profound structural ideas in the entire biblical narrative. It suggests that what humans experience as their world, their history, their struggle, may be the continuation of a conflict that began before any of it existed. That the chaos of human experience is not the root problem. It is the downstream consequence of something that happened somewhere else, to beings we have never met, over a disagreement we were never part of. And then we were born into the middle of it. This is the question that the text almost refuses to answer. Why is this not explained? Why does the Bible, a text that goes into extraordinary detail about genealogies, about the dimensions of temples, about the specific fabrics used in priestly garments, give us so little about an event of this magnitude? If a war in heaven is the foundation of the conflict that drives the entire biblical narrative, why is it treated with so little narrative space? There are a few possible answers. One is that the original audience already knew. Ancient Near Eastern cosmology was full of stories about heavenly conflict, the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Ugaritic myths of Baal and Yam, various Egyptian accounts of divine warfare. The people who first received these texts lived in a world saturated with stories about gods and divine beings at war. The biblical writers may have assumed a shared background that we no longer have. What reads to us as a cryptic fragment may have read to its original audience as a knowing reference, a reframing of familiar material rather than a new revelation. Another possibility is that the silence is intentional, not because the information doesn't exist, but because certain things are not meant to be known fully. This is a pattern in the Bible that shows up repeatedly. Moses is allowed to see the back of God, not the face. The full name of God is treated with extraordinary caution. Job is confronted with the mystery of creation, but never given its explanation. The text seems, in certain places, to be deliberately withholding, not to frustrate, but to preserve something, to keep the mystery intact. And there is a third possibility that is harder to sit with. What if the account is incomplete because the writers themselves were working with fragments? What if the war in heaven was not a story that was ever fully told, even within the communities that produced the texts? What if it was always a mystery, even to those who believed it most deeply, a thing that happened before human witness was possible, a thing that could only be glimpsed from the edges, reported in the language of vision and symbol, because no other language was adequate? The Book of Enoch, a text that didn't make it into most versions of the Bible, but is quoted in the New Testament, and was considered authoritative by many early Jewish and Christian communities, goes further than almost any canonical text in describing the events before humanity. It describes a group of heavenly beings called Watchers who descended to earth, made choices they were not supposed to make, and were imprisoned as a consequence. It describes conflict, rebellion, and judgment in language more specific than anything in Revelation. Whether you read this text as revelation or as ancient speculation, it reveals something important. The desire to understand what happened before us is not modern. It is as old as the question itself. People have always wanted to know what the war in heaven was. They've written about it, argued about it, built entire theological systems around competing interpretations of it. The Apocrypha is full of attempts to fill in the gaps. Medieval scholars produced elaborate hierarchies of angels and their ranks and their roles in the conflict. Milton wrote an entire